Hey, welcome everybody. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name's Abe Miller-Rushing. I'm the science coordinator for the park. I spend about half my time over on MDI and half my time over here at CERC. How many people, is everybody really familiar with CERC? Is anybody new to CERC campus? I see mostly familiar faces, so okay, great. So everybody's all familiar, so I don't have to give introductory remarks to CERC. So I'll just introduce Kate Miller, who's going to be talking about 8 years of forest health research in Acadia. So the park, we're really blessed to have Kate, actually. So she's a part of our inventory and monitoring program. So the National Park Service, we have a bunch of people whose job it is to essentially keep track, to monitor the forests, our water, our air, and whatnot, to make sure that we're maintaining healthy forests and water and ecosystems and managing our natural and cultural resources forever, which is essentially what our mission is. And Kate is a plant ecologist with the inventory and monitoring program who's permanently stationed here at Acadia, but also helps out with a bunch of other parks throughout the Northeast. And we're really lucky to have her. She does a very good program. I think, did you even develop the protocols for this program? So the 8 years she's been involved, she designed the study to do this 8 years of study, and she'll be reporting on the work that she's been doing and her group has been doing over the past 8 years. So thank you very much, and look forward to it.
Well, thanks, Abe, for the introduction. I'm going to be giving some highlights of the forest monitoring that we've been doing the last 8 years in Acadia. So first I'll just give a little background on the Northeast Temperate Network, which is the network with the INM program that we have here. Overview of the forest program, and then I'm going to go into some of our results, including our Ecological Integrity Scorecard, forest soil chemistry analysis that we did, and then some comparisons with coastal Maine forests using other data outside of Park Service. So I think everyone's probably aware of the Organic Act, preserve and protect natural and historic resources forever, basically unimpaired. And you can't really protect something if you don't know what you have and you don't know the condition of it to make sure that it's unimpaired. And that's basically the mission of the Inventory Monitoring Network. So the initial phase of Inventory Monitoring Network was to conduct baseline inventories in all of the parks. And these inventories included vegetation maps, small mammal surveys, amphibian surveys. And in Acadia, we probably knew a lot of what we were doing in the baseline inventories in a lot of the smaller historic parks. This was kind of the first time that like ecologists were out and surveying the natural resources in the parks. So we learned a lot from the baseline inventory phase. And now we're in the vital sign monitoring phase, which is long-term monitoring of ecosystem condition. We call them vital signs. It's kind of the same thing that vital signs of human health with the pulse and all of that. And so the inventory monitoring program is broken up into 32 networks. Each network has about each network has about 8 parks per network. The inventory and monitoring program that we're in is the Northeast Temperate Network. And we have 13 park units from Morristown, New Jersey, up to Acadia in Maine, and we also coordinate monitoring along the Appalachian Trail. The two main habitat types that we have in our parks are rocky coast resources, so Boston Harbor Islands in Acadia, and then temperate forest, which is most of the other parks. And now I'm going to go through the vital signs that we're monitoring in our network. So we've been monitoring breeding land birds in all of our parks except Boston Harbor Island since 2007. We have an early detection of invasive species program where for each park we come up with a list of 12 to 15 species that are either at low levels or not present but are close and a big threat to the park resources. And using that target list, if we come across a species on that list, then we let the park resource manager know, and then they can go out and eradicate it quickly. And we're also starting to use iPhones to collect this information, and this is something available to the public as well. Right now, the smartphone app that we're using is What's Invasive, and if you type in What's Invasive on Google, you can you can find out about it. It's something you can use with a smartphone. You can also record that information online. You can make a report. And now they're actually adapting the What's Invasive app to be park specific so that each park will have a list that you can refer to and report, and that's going to be called IP Alert. The web tool is available right now, but the smartphone app hasn't been developed yet, but that's where we're headed, and something that we're doing in all of our parks and that we're pretty excited about. Forest monitoring is happening in all the parks with forests, basically. So Acadia down to Morristown, New Jersey. Appalachian Trail, the tree is a little dark because we're doing slightly different protocol there, just because of basically the logistics of doing forest monitoring along the trail are much more difficult than our other parks. We have water quality monitoring going on in all of our parks except Boston Harbor Islands, and that's something that Bill Golly, who's in Acadia, it's his program that he runs. Phenology is something that Abe was instrumental in developing the protocol and getting our parks interested. This is a program that it's being implemented as parks are interested. So it's, instead of the network running it, it's something that like the park managers are doing. And then we have weather and climate reports that we're working on that's eventually will be a automatic or auto reporting system that downloads information from different sources, such as like Prism, if anyone's heard that, and then creates weather and climate reports for all of our parks. And then we have some park-specific protocols that we're monitoring, and Acadia has quite a few park-specific. So we have salt marsh monitoring, freshwater wetland monitoring, rare community monitoring, which is basically monitoring stunted woodlands, and then we also have rocky intertidal and forest amphibians. And then there are two national programs that are going on in all of our parks, and that's air quality, which Bill Golly is also the manager of that program in Acadia, and then landscape dynamics. So going to the forest health program, our protocol's based on the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis program, and I'll go into their program more a little bit later. But the key was to have a protocol that was similar enough that we can compare with their data. We have 350 plots across 10 park units. 176 of those are in Acadia, and we sample every plot every 4 years. The overall goal of our program is to monitor trends in structure, function, and composition of forest ecosystems, including soils, and then we're also trying to monitor key stressors that may be impacting them. And then also to interpret forest condition to our park managers to help inform decisions. So as I mentioned, we have 176 plots in Acadia, and we measure 44 every year. And this map shows all of the plots that we have, and they're coded by forest type. So the red triangles are red spruce fir forests, and the point here is just that most of the forests in Acadia, or most of our forest plots, are red spruce fir forest. There are also quite a few woodlands. This is the upside-down yellow triangles. So woodlands are in areas where it's really harsh soil and growing conditions, and so we don't really get closed canopy forests just because of such a harsh environment. And it's important to monitor those because they're probably more sensitive to other stressors just because they're already in a stressful environment, but we have different expectations for those forest types than the closed canopy forest, so often we have to separate them in our analysis. So Schoodic, we have 10 plots, and then Idaho, we have 19, and then everything else is on eastern MDI, across MDI. So just going to go through our forest plot layout so you can get an idea of what we measure. On the larger plot in Acadia, it's 15 by 15 meters, which is about 50 feet by 50 feet, I think. We measure all trees, the diameter, we assess tree condition of each tree, and then we collect some standard site info along with a vascular species plant list. We measure regeneration in 3 2-meter radius microplots. We collect a soil sample outside of the plot, and that location moves so that we're not sampling the same location every year, but it's also outside of the plot, so we're not doing any kind of disturbance in the plot. We collect coarse woody debris measurements along these transects, so any piece that falls across one of the red lines, we measure the length and the diameter and species. We collect vascular species percent cover in these 8 quadrats. They're meter by a meter. And then we also take photo points at every plot so that we can visually track change through time as well. So we primarily rely on an ecological integrity scorecard to report condition of forests in our parks. And so ecological integrity is a measure of ecosystem condition to compare to the system's natural range of variation and ability to withstand disturbance. Metrics relate to structure, function, and composition, so kind of all aspects of the forest. They're based on scientific literature, models, and expert opinion. And for each metric, we evaluate condition using good, caution, and significant concern categories, so that good is, good. I think everyone knows what good means. Caution is that maybe it's approaching the limits of natural variation, and then significant concern is that there's a real problem that may warrant management action. So before I actually go into the results of the scorecard, I probably need to define what we think of as good condition for forests in Acadia. So that's what the next few slides are going to be about. And so backing up a little bit, in most of New England, including Acadia, the forests we see today are reflective of past disturbances, including natural and specifically major human disturbances that occurred in the last century or so. The 1947 fire that everyone's probably familiar with, it's still very obvious on the landscape on eastern MDI. Pretty much all of the park has been logged at some point over the last 100 or so years. There's a very small stand that we know of that hasn't in western MDI. But otherwise, everything's pretty much been logged at least once. And then some areas have been cultivated or grazed. And one point to make here is that forests that come back after logging or forests that come back from farming, they tend to be different forest types. And a lot of it has to do with the disturbance to the soil layer or not. And so we see these signatures throughout the forest in Acadia. So following a major disturbance, which all of the forests in Acadia basically have followed some major disturbance in the last century, there are 7 stages of development, and this is based on Ron Davis, who is a professor at University of Maine, and his PhD was basically a treatise on coastal spruce fir forests and the dynamics in those forests. So he describes 7 stages following a disturbance, and I'm going to go through those stages. The first stage is a high proportion of paper birch. It's just a lot of small diameter paper birch and aspen. There's actually not a lot of examples of this in the park because there hasn't been really recent disturbances. The second stage is where you start to get spruce regeneration under the birch and aspen. So aspen and birch are very shade intolerant. They can't regenerate under their own shade. They need a large disturbance that they can come up. And so in the second stage, which there are a lot of examples of this in eastern MDI, the paper birch forms a canopy, and then you get spruce regeneration underneath, which is more shade tolerant. And in some cases, the spruce and the birch are the same age. The spruce are just much more slower growing. The next stage, which is also pretty common in Acadia, especially in eastern MDI, is you start to get birch and aspen die off. They're not very long-lived trees, and as they die off, the spruce is released, and so you get, especially in stage 4, you get a thicket of spruce. Sometimes people call it a dog hair thicket. Also a lot of examples of this in the park. Not the most fun habitat to work in, I'll say. Okay, so stage 5 is where you start to get mature forests, and a lot of western MDI, a lot of Schoodic are mature forest. So if you think of the thicket kind of growing up into bigger trees, it's still one cohort getting bigger, and so it's pretty uniform. The trees are all about the same size, same age, and the canopy is also very uniform. But I should go back for a second. There's not a lot of regeneration under here, if you can tell. There's just not room for it or resources for it. And so it's immature where you start to get some seedling regeneration. But it's of spruce. So it's the spruce is now able to replace spruce. So it's the same species and canopy in the understory. So uniform canopy, as I said. And then The transition to late successional forest isn't always pretty, and this is happening in a lot of places. It's happening all over the coast. And so to get late successional forest, you have to have some trees dying and or some windthrow. So it's the transition to stage 6 to have more of a complex structure. Usually you have some windthrow. And late successional forest, the difference between that and mature forest is you start to get more coarse woody debris. So you can see there's a log down. There's just more structure and complexity everywhere. So more dead wood, more regeneration, more differentiation in the canopy because you have some trees that have persisted and some that have died. And then you'll start to get some larger trees. So trees over 30 centimeters diameter, which is about a foot in diameter, become a little more common, and then also start to get some saplings. Now, old growth, which I think people tend to get excited about old growth. In Acadia, there's only one stand that we know of that's old growth. A lot of it, unfortunately, is blown down over the last 20 years, but it's on Bernard Mountain, if you're interested. And old growth is just kind of a continuation from late successional, where more structure and more complexity. So you have an advanced regeneration layer of shade-tolerant species. So it's, again, the species in the understory or the species in the overstory. A layered multi-age canopy, which I'll show a picture of that next, and then abundant coarse woody debris and snags in various stages of decay and sizes. So again, this is a picture from the stand in Bernard Mountain where there's some really large spruce and then there's smaller ones. It's not as extreme as you would think of if you've been to the old growth stands in Northern California or the Pacific Northwest. We don't get trees that big, but it's still striking and it's different and it's important. Okay, so the natural disturbance regime of old growth spruce fir forests are primarily single tree fall or small scale disturbances. Large stand replacing disturbances like the fire of 47 are unusual. The fire of 47 was an unusually large disturbance. And then based on what research you looked to, 50 to 75% of Maine forests prior to European settlement were old growth. And so a major assumption of our ecological integrity scorecard is given time, most forests in Acadia should succeed to old growth. I mean, given centuries perhaps, but still that's the trajectory that the forest should follow. And so our scorecard is either measuring that trajectory, so our plots moving in that direction, or measuring stressors that could disrupt that, like invasive species. So this is just an example of some of the metrics we have in our scorecard, and I'm not expecting you to process this or digest it right away, but it's just to show that there are numbers behind the rating categories that we use. These are about half of the metrics that we have, and they relate to all aspects of forests. And this is the scorecard for Acadia, the last 4 years of monitoring, and you'll notice that there's a lot of good. If you look at some of our other parks, there's a lot of significant concern. So this is a really good scorecard. And most of the metrics that are not rated good or that are caution or significant concern relate to the fact that forests in Acadia are pretty young. And so I'm going to go into these metrics, kind of some of them one at a time, and just go into more detail. So the structural stage metric, it measures the proportion of plots in successional stages, so mature, late successional, and pole, which is like early successional. And so the majority of plots in Acadia, especially in Schoodic, are mature, so kind of even-aged mature forests. And so all of the parks were all of the units were at least rated caution because we would expect at least 50% of the plots to be in late successional to be rated good. To be rated significant concern, there has to be less than 50% mature and late successional, so all the parks at least made it to caution park units except for Eastern MDI because of the fire. And it's not that there's early successional forest that's the problem on Eastern MDI, it's just the lack of late successional forest that is the problem because it's important habitat for a lot of organisms. But again, through time, we expect these to improve. So this is really taking like a long view of forests in Acadia. Snag abundance and coarse woody debris are also metrics that are expected to improve with time. So Coarse woody debris in all of the park units are lower than expected levels. The reason Schoodic is not rated is because we need at least 10 plots to rate coarse woody debris, and we don't use woodland plots because we don't expect a lot of coarse woody debris in woodlands, which half of the plots in Schoodic are. Woodland is like less than 60% canopy cover due to harsh growing environment. So like the stunted jack pine woodlands that are all over here, we're not including them in the coarse woody debris metric because we don't know how much coarse woody debris there should be there, for one thing, and we don't want to have as high a bar as we have on forests, because forests should, like closed canopy forests should have more coarse woody debris. But it would, if you look at the number, it would be rated in the caution category. Snag Abundance is, it's good on Idaho, and it's good on Western MDI. The density of snags is actually highest in Schoodic, but one part of our metric is we need at least 5 trees over 30 centimeters diameter per hectare to be rated at least caution, because it's important habitat for cavity nesting birds, and there are no trees that big in our plots, no dead snags in any of our plots on Schoodic that meet that category. So that's why Schoodic is a significant concern. And I guess I just want to stress the importance of dead wood. It may not seem pretty, and I think a lot of, and we see this with some of our park managers too, they think that in order to do the right thing and keep a forest healthy, they need to clear out the dead wood. But it's actually really, really important habitat. It's important for, I think everyone knows it's important for woodpeckers, but it's also important for a lot of fungi and insects and amphibians. It's really, really important stuff. Some tree species really only successfully regenerate when they have dead wood as a habitat. So I just want to say it's really important. And there's not enough of it on the landscape generally. Okay, so tree regeneration in Acadia is abundant. And we have 2 parts of this tree regeneration metric. One is amount of regeneration, so that's the first one. So again, there's plenty. And then we also look at patterns of regeneration and how they compare with what we know of late successional structure. So in general, we either have a lot of saplings or a lot of seedlings in our parks. We don't have a good combination of them, and that's why it's rated caution. Again, we expect it to improve in time. Deer browse impacts are minimal in Acadia. We see very little evidence of deer browse in our plots. So at each forest plot, we assess the impact of deer based on presence of scat or deer trails or browsing, and we really just don't see a lot of it. The few plots that were rated high were all either near roads or trails where there was edge habitat, so it's kind of expected. But really, there's not, within Acadia, there's not a lot of deer browse impact. And this is just to show what deer browse impact really looks like. This is in Morristown, New Jersey. This is our furthest south park, and they've had extensive deer problem for decades. And there's nothing growing under the height of a deer's mouth, if you can see that. It's just nothing, and regeneration has been failing in that park for decades. And so it's impacting forest dynamics because we don't have young trees going into the canopy. So that's what deer impact looks like. Tree condition in Acadia is pretty good. We've only detected 2 forest pests in our plots, one of which is beech bark disease. I guess it's a pathogen that's been around for a long time, and then balsam woolly adelgid, which is similar to hemlock woolly adelgid. It's not quite as severe. It does impact balsam fir and does increase mortality, but it's not quite as severe as hemlock woolly adelgid. Oh, I guess I'll say that the few plots that were rated significant concern, they were usually either near a swamp where there was standing water, so it was a stressful point in time for that plot, or it was elevated herbivory, but just small. I mean, this is what we would want to see for tree condition. This is proportion of plots in each category. Okay. So while I said that tree condition is generally pretty good in Acadia, there are some pests that are a big threat to forests in Acadia. So emerald ash borer is one pest that attacks ash. It's 100% mortality of ash wherever it infests. And it's been expanding on the East Coast over the years. It's probably not quite as extreme of a threat to Acadia because we don't have a ton of ash, whereas in Saratoga, which is in New York, there's a lot of ash in Saratoga, and we're really concerned about emerald ash borer in that park. That's going to really impact forests in that park. Hemlock woolly adelgid has been found on Mount Desert Island in nursery plantings. It hasn't been found in interior forests, so it's not a true, it's not considered truly part of its range. If hemlock woolly adelgid were to establish an interior forest in the park, it would affect some ravines pretty drastically, but there's not a ton of hemlock in the rest of the park. The biggest threat probably is Asian longhorn beetle. So even though Asian longhorn beetle is kind of confined to that small area in Massachusetts, the host species of Asian longhorn beetle is maple, which is the second most common species. Red maple is the second most common species in Acadia. So if Asian longhorn beetle were to make it up here, it would be a huge problem. A winter moth is kind of a newer pest that I think just in the last 5 or 10 years that we've been hearing about. And there's been some mortality, increased mortality in eastern Massachusetts that's been documented because of winter moth. It was recently detected in Hancock County over the last 2 winters. And we haven't detected it in our forest plots, but we probably won't until it becomes a real problem because of their timing. They're out really early in the spring before we're in our plots, and then they're flying in the winter. So we're not necessarily going to capture that, but they are known to be at least on MDI. So don't move firewood. That's what I was supposed to say. That's important. Okay, invasive species. So this is invasive plant species. In Acadia, forests are largely composed of native species, which is great. We've only detected invasive species in 3 out of 176 plots, which is also, it's great. And compared to our other parks, we have a number of parks that have pretty extreme invasive species problems. So in context with the rest of our network, Acadia is in really good shape with invasive species. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of what the invasive species look like in some of our other parks, just to kind of show why invasive species are bad. This is glossy buckthorn in Minuteman. Most of the understory in Minuteman is glossy buckthorn like this. And it's really dense, and I think as you can imagine, there's not a lot that can grow underneath that. This is exotic honeysuckle in Saratoga. About half of Saratoga is covered in this honeysuckle thicket, and again, it's suppressing forest regeneration. There are a few species that can actually penetrate the thicket, tree species, and it's also just, it reduces diversity of plants. And this is barberry, Japanese barberry in Morristown. Again, about half of Morristown is covered in this barberry thicket. And so it's bad for forest health, but it's also, there's a human health component to this. It's bad for people because a number of studies have shown in all the species that I just mentioned that where you get these thickets, you have almost double the density of ticks, of deer ticks, and then they also have a higher incidence of carrying Lyme disease. So bad for forests and also bad for people. Going back to the Ecological Integrity Scorecard, one aspect of condition that's really hard to assess is soil chemistry. So we have 2 metrics that we look at, but they really are a pretty simplistic view of soils. So, so backing up for a second, the main interest we have with monitoring soil condition is acid deposition, where we're really interested in what the impacts of acid deposition may be on our plots. So impacts of acid deposition include acidification, which is basically the soils become more acidic, a loss of soil nutrients and increased availability of aluminum, which is toxic to plant roots. Nitrogen saturation, so nitrogen normally is a limiting nutrient in forests, and so when more nitrogen is coming down, so acid rain includes nitrates and sulfate deposition. That's what acid rain is, and so nitrogen is being deposited through acid rain, and so saturation of that can cause problems. And then generally, acid deposition or acid rain doesn't always kill the tree outright, but it's more that it's stressed. The tree is now stressed and more susceptible to other stressors. And so like red spruce is more susceptible to cold damage, less winter hardy in areas with high deposition. So there's another network, Eastern Rivers and Mountains Network. They have parks in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and they also are monitoring forests similarly to us, including soils. And we got together and did a regional analysis to find out how our parks compare with vulnerability to acid deposition. And what's interesting about this map shows the deposition rates across the East Coast, and the dark red is more, and it goes to blue is low deposition rate. So the parks in Eastern Rivers and Mountains Network are in some of the highest deposition rates in the country, whereas Acadia is very low. So it's kind of a gradient from high deposition to low deposition. So we did an ordination, a multivariate ordination. I'm not going to actually go into how I did the ordination. If you want to know, please talk to me. I love talking about this stuff. But I'm going to give the results and just interpret the results for you. So basically, we're able to identify a gradient of vulnerability or risk to deposition or acidification. And we were able, this plot, this is called ordination plot, and each circle or square is a plot. It represents a soil sample from a plot. And so plots that are in the group 1, the most red, are most vulnerable to acidification or may have impacts of acidification, and then plots in group 5 are least vulnerable. So it's just a gradient of vulnerability. And so we assessed for each plot which group they were in, and we looked at it by park. So the pie charts on the right show the proportion of plots in each one of those groups. And for Eastern Rivers and Mountains Network, what was interesting is that parks, so Johnstown flood appeared to have the most impacts potentially of acidification. So most of the plots, that's JOFL, were in the 2 most at-risk categories, whereas Friendship Hill, which is not far off of Johnstown flood, also has pretty high deposition rates, was in mostly the less vulnerable categories, and that's because they have limestone bedrock, and so they're well-buffered soils. So in Eastern Rivers and Mountains, it came down to basically if the park had some kind of limestone substrate or bedrock, they were less susceptible, and parks that had a lot of topography, the high elevation plots were most susceptible, the low elevation were less susceptible. So, I mean, I guess things you would expect. For Northeast Temperate Network, what was interesting is that even though Acadia has the lowest deposition rates, it's the most vulnerable of all of our parks to acidification. The soils are poorly buffered, they're very acidic already, and so it doesn't take much for soils to be impacted in Acadia, whereas other parks like Saratoga was very robust to acidification. Saratoga has a history of cultivation. It's possible that some of those soils were amended even, and so they're even less susceptible just because they may have been limed. But really, I think the take home here is that Acadia is really susceptible to acid deposition. So we also did an analysis of each forest plot in Acadia using O-horizon. That was an A-horizon analysis. This is O-horizon. And really, this is just to point out that we have these kind of risk scores now, and we're going to try to follow those plots through time and see if plots that show most vulnerability, if we see differences in forest health in those plots. Nitrogen saturation is another concern about acid deposition, and so we looked at the carbon to nitrogen ratio and also stream nitrate data. So when soils are saturated with nitrogen, they export nitrate, and then you can pick up that signature in the stream. And Acadia, you want a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so Acadia has the highest, so it's not very vulnerable to to N deposition. And then Saratoga has a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio and also has a very high nitrate stream concentration. So it's possible that Saratoga is experiencing saturation of nitrogen because of deposition. The only caveat here is that you can't separate nitrogen sources, so nitrogen coming from the soil versus nitrogen coming from agricultural source. You can't separate that. Saratoga is surrounded by agriculture, so we don't really know for sure, but we're definitely going to keep an eye on this. Okay, so just kind of to summarize what I've already said, forest soils in Acadia are vulnerable to acidification, which is becoming more acidic. They're robust to deposition of N, so they're not likely to be saturated by nitrogen. The next steps here are to relate the results that we have to indicators of forest health, like tree growth rates or mortality rates. And then there are two other networks that are monitoring similar to us in their parks. And so we're going to try to add the National Capital Region and Mid-Atlantic Network parks to the analysis. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the soil analysis that we did. And this is another project that we worked on, was analyzing forest inventory analysis data around our parks. So the forest inventory analysis dates back as early as the 1930s. There was a revised inventory in 2000 that has a multi-tiered approach. There are phase 1 plots that are remote sensing, so basically just GIS analysis. They don't actually go out and visit every plot. There's a phase 2 that's ground sampling of forest variables, primarily related to timber resources. And then there's phase 3, which is forest health monitoring, that is most similar to our plots. And the density of plots is that there's one P2 plot per 6,000 acres, and then there's 1 out of 16 P2 plots are phase 3 plots. So there aren't as many, the density of forest health monitoring plots isn't as high, but this covers the entire country, and they're starting to work in Alaska now, so it's a huge data set, and they sample their plots in 5-year rotation. So I showed our forest plot, the colors that we have in our plot that are translated here. This is the FIA plot, so the colors from our plot that are the same here mean that it's a comparable measurement. So they also have coarse woody debris. They call it down woody material, but they have a coarse woody debris protocol that they sample. They sample regeneration, very similar to us. Their tree measurements that they take are very similar to us. And their vascular species measurement is very similar. So to do this analysis, we took the ecological subsection that each park was in. So ecological subsection is the boundary that the Forest Service generated, that anything within this boundary should have a similar climate, similar topography, and so we expect them to have similar forests. And this shows all of the plots that FIA is monitoring in this ecological subsection. It's called the Maine Eastern Coastal Subsection, including some in Acadia. And based on their data, no surprise, the vast majority of this area is forested, so over 60% is forested. Only 4% is not in timber production, that's the reserved category, so only 4% is not actively being managed for timber. And the vast majority of it is in private ownership. So one question that we had was, forests in Acadia are under different management regimes because we're not logging forests in Acadia. And so do forest health metrics differ between the park and the surrounding matrix of forest land? And the answer is yes. So looking at the successional stages that I talked about before with our structural stage metric, so even though we don't have as much late successional forest as we would want in Acadia, there's more late successional forest proportionally in Acadia than the surrounding matrix of forest. There's actually very little. This is less than 5% is late successional along the coast outside of Acadia. And there's also a high degree of pole stands, so earlier successional outside of Acadia. Average density of live trees over a foot in diameter is also higher in Acadia than in the surrounding matrix. So the green is the surrounding matrix of forest lands. That's the FIA data. Average density of snags is also higher in the park than outside of the park. Volume of coarse woody debris also higher. So these are all metrics that you would expect to be better in older forests, or higher in older forests, and also probably higher in non-managed forests. Tree growth rates, interestingly, are lower in Acadia than the surrounding matrix. And if you think about forest management, often the goal is to have the highest yield of timber. And so forests are harvested on a rotation that allows for the greatest amount of growth in some places. And so it's not really a big surprise that growth rates in Acadia are slower. And the forests are older, and so they probably have a lower growth rate anyway. Tree mortality is about the same. I showed this because Schoodic looks like it has a pretty high mortality rate, and this is primarily with red spruce. It looks like Schoodic, most of the forests are kind of towards the end of the mature stage where they're starting to break up and move into late successional stage, and that's why we think there's a higher mortality rate, but we're definitely looking more into it and trying to figure out exactly what's going on. Okay, so just to kind of summarize everything that I talked about, forests are largely composed of native species in Acadia, and that's great. And putting it into context to the rest of the network, that's unusual that they're in such good shape that way. Regeneration is abundant, and deer impacts are minimal. Overall tree condition is good. We are concerned about acid deposition on forest soils with acidification concern. And there's not enough late successional structure or late successional stands. But compared to the surrounding matrix of forest lands, there's more late successional and mature forests in Acadia, greater abundance of late successional structure, lower tree growth rates, all kind of pointing to the fact that even though it's below the desired levels of what we want, it's Acadia forests are kind of regionally significant in having older forest structure compared to the surrounding matrix, and in time that's expected to increase even more. So threats to forests in Acadia, invasive plant species is a big one, as I kind of alluded to before. Exotic forest pests and pathogens, another big concern. Lack of coarse woody debris and snags, another concern. A lot of critters require that habitat. Acid deposition is a big one, and then climate change, of course, is huge. But these are really the top three are the only ones that we really have control over. So invasive species management, I think, is really important to continue in the park. Even though it seems like invasives are at low levels, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that folks have been managing invasives in the forest, or just in the park in general, and there haven't been a lot of disturbances yet. And then exotic forest pests and pathogens, I say this as vigilance to try to catch early infestations so that maybe they're manageable, but also just outreach to make sure that everyone's aware that it's important not to move firewood from places that may have forest pests and pathogens. And perhaps it's inevitable that emerald ash borer at some point is going to be here, but the more we can slow it, the more kind of hope there is that maybe a biocontrol comes online that is effective at controlling it. So it's all about slowing the spread so that maybe we have a chance to save ash. And then lack of dead wood. I mean, I think this maybe surprise people that we have some control over it, but it's not always seen as important, and so sometimes wood is removed from areas where it shouldn't be because maybe it's not seen as pretty. And I say this less for Acadia. We have other parks that managers have actively been removing dead wood to kind of keep things aesthetically pleasing, and we're trying to say, no, don't do that. It's important. So just overall, as long as forests are left to succeed and stressors do not disrupt forest processes, we expect forest condition to improve over time in Acadia. We'd be nowhere without our forest crews. This is the last cycle of our forest crews, and I just want to mention Jesse Wheeler, if I can get my mouse over. Whoops. He's our forest crew leader. He's been with us for 5 years. He's just as much a part of this as I am. He's not giving the talk today, but I just wanted to credit him. He's been really important in this program. And so I'd be happy to take any questions, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
As people ask questions, Alexa and I will pass around a microphone, and it's just because we're recording it, and so this way, when you speak into the microphone, your voice will make it onto the recording too.
You didn't mention, unless I missed it, anything about balsam fir, and the areas around here have been really hit hard with losing the balsam fir. Is that also true in the park, and do you measure that mortality rate different than the other trees?
Yeah, we do have a pretty high balsam fir mortality rate, higher than spruce for sure, at least double the spruce mortality rate. And I think part of it's balsam lily adelgid, part of it's that fir are not quite as long-lived as red spruce, and so they're more likely to die out. But yeah, it's something we're tracking, and there's some unknowns about why the mortality rate is high. So, yeah, does that help or not? Yeah, we are tracking it. I mean, every tree in a plot, we're tracking its, from regeneration to tree to dying, we're tracking it the whole life cycle. So, yeah.
For the uncontrollables, you might have mentioned this, but the acidification, what's the source of it and how's it going over the last couple of decades? I was under the illusion it all comes from Gary, Indiana, and the steel plants there don't put out very much anymore. And the second thing is, where's climate change going to take us?
Yeah, so both very good questions. So it is true that we're not the source of the acid deposition. It's, we're just downwind of it. And it has been decreasing since the Clean Air Act, and so things are getting better in some ways. We only really have an 8-year snapshot for our forests, so we don't know what they were before, and we haven't really seen any change yet, but it's something that we're definitely tracking. We're hoping to see some kind of improvement in the soils, knowing that the deposition rates are decreasing, but we haven't seen that yet. We don't really have a long enough data set to see that yet. And climate change is kind of everywhere. So, I mean, the big question is, a lot of the models are saying that we're going to lose spruce fir forests, particularly balsam fir. If you look at the predictions that the Forest Service has made, balsam fir is it's going to decline at a rapid rate because of climate change. It's very sensitive to changes. However, if you look at the paleo record, it tells us that there's been a spruce fir band along the coast for about 10,000 years. And even times that were warmer than are now, there was a coastal spruce fir forest. So a lot of the models are based on Forest Service data, the FIA data, and it's too coarse to really get at what changes may be happening here. Their models are kind of like statewide or region-wide models, and we're interested in the coast. So it's a big question. We may still have spruce fir forest for a long time because, the paleo record says we did. Or, it could become oak hickory. We don't really know. It's a big question that actually some of our data is being used to assess that for a project looking, I think it's like Acadia and spruce fir forest, so it goes all the way up into Canada. There's a project looking at that with some researchers in Minnesota. So I'll tell you later when we find out, I guess. Yeah.
I don't know whether the Schoodic region that you mentioned is just the park or beyond it, but I do know that a lot of the Schoodic area has been heavily logged since the 1840s even, and a lot of it recently. So I'm wondering if the high mortality would have something to do with the fact that the trees are sort of all of an even age and they're reaching their point of falling over.
Yeah, I think that is what's happening. They're all right. They're kind of transitioning from mature to later successional, and that process, trees die. But we are only looking at plots in the park, like in the park right now, like fee lands. So
I certainly noticed this in the area immediately outside the park as well.
yeah, it's happening in a lot of areas. So yeah.
I noticed this a few years ago. We were traveling out in the Grand Canyon area, and they apparently out there have controlled burning of some of the forest lands, which I haven't heard of around here.
Yeah, so fire is not a big part of the natural disturbance regime of forests out here. It's huge in western forests, but this is a pretty wet environment. There aren't a lot of sources. We don't get a lot of lightning, which would be the natural fire source. So it's just paleo records and land surveys from before European settlement. They don't really show a lot of evidence of a lot of fire. There were some fires in the past, but it's not a big component of the forest here to stay healthy.
These were set fires out there to control the forest.
Yeah, and it's really important that they're managing that way out west. Not so much here.
One other question I had, I guess, do we have any areas of forests in the Acadia area where the trees are 100 years old even?
Yeah, definitely. We're actually coring trees on some of our plots in Mount Desert Island right now, and we've gotten 2 cores that were 150 years old, and most of what we get are between 50 and 80 years, which would be kind of the mature forest that we would expect. But yeah, so there's a fair amount on the western side of MDI. There's also some in state land, Black Mountain area, if you've been there, Schoodic Lake area, that definitely are over 100 years old. And generally, once you start to see trees that are over 1 foot in diameter, those are pretty old trees. White pine, not so much. It can grow pretty fast, pretty quickly, or pretty big pretty quickly. But yeah, once you start seeing trees approaching that size, you can probably think that they're 80 to 100 or more years old.
One last question, I guess, a little different, but earlier when you first started out, you mentioned small animals. Hardly ever come out Schoodic and even see so much as a rabbit.
Well, they set traps, humane traps, I think, to do their surveys. I wasn't involved in the small mammal survey, so I don't really know, but I think usually it involves putting out live traps that maybe have some form of bait in them that attract the animals, and then they capture them, and then they know what's here. So.
Kate, early on you depicted the invasive species and you mentioned 3. Are those present in the park currently?
They are, yeah.
And can you talk about to what extent they are?
Yeah, so they're primarily around the Great Meadow watershed on eastern MDI. That's where most of those species are. So it's really wherever there were kind of people previously living what's now park. So a lot of the area around Bar Harbor, when it burned, some of those areas were just kind of abandoned and they became park. And those are the areas that tend to have the most invasives. Or they were planted by like George Dorr. But so yeah, bush honeysuckle, we've seen a bit here and there. Glossy buckthorn is probably the most common invasive around, and glossy buckthorn can occur in wet and dry areas, so it has a pretty broad tolerance, and that's probably the most threat. And that's really widespread in the Great Meadow watershed. So.
And what's the management strategy when you find those? Is it remove at all costs, or how do you deal with that?
It depends on the species. So if it's an early detection species, which glossy buckthorn is not because it's already pretty established in places, if it's early detection, we let the park manager know. Usually we flag it and they come out and pull it. We don't actually do any management. We're kind of bystanders, and if we're walking to a plot and we find something, we'll pull it on our way. But we don't spend a lot of time doing it, and we don't do any management in our plots because we don't want our plots to start looking like they're less invaded than they're supposed to be representative of the forest. So if we're managing our plots, then they're not going to be representative anymore. And so we give locations of everything that we find to the parks, and then they do what they want to do with it. And generally, they usually have a priority list of what they want to manage, so they decide what to do.
I did that invasive app thing.
Mm-hmm.
It actually lists 29 invasive species for Acadia. Is that like overdoing it? Or are they like found one plant? Or?
Well, yeah, some parks are interested in looking for more than just the 12 or 15 species that we come up with, and I think that's partially why Acadia's list is so long, so that Acadia has a pretty good volunteer program that I think volunteers have actually gone out actively looking for invasive species, and so they probably have a longer list than for other parks where it's just a few staff that know how to identify species, or just our forest crew will have a much reduced list, so that they just have to know 12 species, and those are the ones that are really of most interest if we find them. So.
I have a question on the acidification issue. If our soil around here is naturally acidic, and if the plant life, therefore, is the kind of plant life that does okay or well in that kind of soil, why is this area the most vulnerable to problems from increased acid?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And interestingly, so red spruce, even though it occurs in acidic environments like Acadia, where it's really abundant, it's really sensitive to acid deposition because the acid actually eats away the cuticle on the needles, and that's how it becomes more susceptible to cold damage. So in a way, yes, they are maybe adapted for acidic conditions, but it's more that, like, they're already acidic. Once they get more acidic, it's too much. Aluminum's really toxic, and that usually increases aluminum availability. But it's also, the soil is acidic, but these species aren't adapted for really acidic rain, and so it's above ground impacts that can happen too. But I am not a chemist. So that's a plant ecologist take on it.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Kate. That was really
Thank you.
informative.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you very
everyone.
much. And I also wanted to let Seth Benz wanted to announce an upcoming talk.
So on Thursday, March 27th at 7 p.m. here, we will be hosting Dr. Jeffrey Wells, who is the senior scientist for the boreal forest. And to know something about the boreal forest, is the most intact forest across the northern North America and extending elsewhere. But it's our nursery for over 80% of the birds that we see in migration. So he will be here doing a slide presentation Thursday night, March 27th at 7 p.m. Hope to see you then. Thank you.